Namaste to everybody and Tashdelek, and good morning to our friends in Europe, and very early good morning to our friends in North America, and good afternoon to our friends in Australia, in Taiwan, and of course, good evening to our friends in Australia and Japan. So today we have in our series, which is going on since 2014. We started these seminars and webinars, and since 2020 April, we started this series on specially focused on China and its colonies. So today we are going to discuss the subject consequences of Xi Jinping's failure on COVID-19 front. And before we start with our panelists, I would love to give you a short introduction of the organizers and our panelists. There are two organizations who are jointly organizing this series of webinars. One is the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, and the other is Tibetan Youth Congress. Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement. It's a New Delhi-based think tank which is focused on understanding issues uh, which the countries around Himalayas are facing regularly. And as I said, this platform is active since 2014. In the beginning, we had series of seminars, but since this COVID, we have shifted to webinars, which we find is much easier than organizing seminars. So that's why we have a very good frequency now, almost, if not two, at least one webinar every month. So, as I said, this platform is engaged in bringing all the thinkers, researchers, and writers, advocacy groups of from different countries who are working on issues related to China and this Himalayan region. And so this is how we are functioning. And then we have Tibetan Youth Congress, which is a worldwide organization of the Tibetan diaspora, and it happens to be the biggest organization of Tibetan diaspora, which has been very effective, very successful over past more than 50 years. And as this organization has performed its duty quite well, organizing the Tibetan communities, in educating them on current affairs, on social responsibility, etc. So this Tibetan Youth Congress it stands for the entire Tibet, which is Utsang, Kham, and Amdo. And one special thing about Tibetan Youth Congress is it has a very clear stand on the issue that it wants total freedom, independence of Tibet to be restored. But at the same time, this organization works as a very active platform for social organizations, and it has functioned as, I think, the best nursery of Tibetan talent, because if you go and see the list of people right from the top, you know, the Kalantripas or Sikyong, I mean, the presidents, prime ministers of Tibet, to the speakers and the parliamentarians, intellectuals, researchers, youth leaders, almost all of them have graduated through Tibetan Youth Congress. So both these organizations welcome all of you. And today, now I will introduce our today's speakers. We have three panelists who are expert in their own domains. First, I would love to introduce Mr. Pierre-Antoine Donnet. He is a senior French journalist. Welcome, Donnet, to this platform once again. Mr. Donnet
Namaste,
is
Dashdirak.
Namaste. And as I said, that he is a veteran senior French journalist who is one of the best known names on issues related to China. He has had a long experience of reporting China and directly from China, because he has been posted for quite a few years, from 1984 to 1989, as the correspondent in Bureau of AFP. Uh, and he has been the global chief news editor also of AFP after that assignment. He has studied language, the Chinese language, in 1980s in Paris, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And already he has three books to his credit, two books which we saw earlier. One is Tibet, Dead or Alive, which came out in 1990. The other was China, the Great Predator, which came out just 1 year ago. And now we are expecting three new books which are in the pipeline. So just before we were discussing, I came to know of these three books, and I'm sure these books will be on the book stand very soon. So thank you very much, Done, for joining us once again, and we'll have surely benefit of your wide experience about China. Then we
Thank you.
have another. Thank you, welcome. And then we have Marco Respinti. Marco Respinti
Namaste.
is already known, well known to our audience. Welcome, Marco, once again. Marco is director in charge of Bitter Winter, which is a magazine on religious liberty and human rights in China. That is their special focus, and it's from Milano, Italy. It comes out in many languages like English, Chinese, Italian, French, German, Spanish, Japanese, and Korean language. That's wonderful, and so that's why we read Bitter Winter references so many times in newspapers. So he is a professional journalist, a researcher, essayist, translator, and lecturer. So Respenti is a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, and he has been a founding member and board member of the Vandenberg Society for European Renewal at The Hague. So welcome, Marco, to this platform once again. And now I
Thank
come
you.
to a very dynamic young Tibetan activist. She is Chemi Lamo. Chemilamo, we have the privilege of having you first time on this platform, and we very much hope that you will be joining us quite frequently. And Chemilamo is, as I said, is a Tibetan activist, uh, and she is quite popular among not only Tibetan community. She lives in Canada and in her local communities in Toronto, Ontario. Also, she is quite famous, and she won in 2019, she won the Tibetan Youth Icon Award. So, and she's Canada representative uh, in the steering committee of International Tibet Network, which is a very active network which provides very current and correct information on Tibet to those people who are interested in Tibet, and not only Tibetans, not only supporters of Tibetans, but also those who have interest in Tibet in China. So she is very active with the ITN, and at personal level, in her own community, I came to know that she is a community health leader in Parkdale People's Economy, and she is quite active on the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust Board. And as a human rights activist, she is a great Tibet organizer also. And she was recognized in Canada's National Current Affairs and News magazine, Maclean's, the top 50 power list of 2022. So we are privileged that we have such a dynamic Tibetan young lady with us. So welcome all of you. And so today's subject, as we said, is the consequences of Xi Jinping's failure on COVID-19 front. Some people may ask a question: how we say Xi Jinping's failure? I think for this, we don't have to prove it. Xi Jinping himself and the government of China, they have been the way they have been, you know, fluctuating between facts which were totally contradictory to each other right from the day one. That shows that even the Chinese government and the President Xi Jinping are not sure what they are talking about. And unfortunately, that has created a lot of problem for the rest of world. But we see, the way China has been misreporting. They started with misreporting the source and intensity of Wuhan virus, and then went on to underreporting the spread of this virus in China. And of course, as communist parties always do, they do over-reporting on their successes. The Chinese so-called Chinese vaccine, the success President Xi Jinping has been talking right from the top of his house. Unfortunately, it proved a total flop. They have been over-reporting about the coverage of this vaccine and other measures, and also the success of the control measures. But at the same time, while misreporting, underreporting, over-reporting, there has been a total blackout of data. And to say it in short, it's very strange that after Wuhan's virus spread to the world, as we know since beginning of January this year, more than 663 million cases had been reported from across the world. And unfortunately, more than 6.7 million people have already died because of Wuhan virus. And there has been trillions of dollars of loss to national economies across the world and social fiber also, and so many other problems. But it's very interesting when I was going through the list of the impact of Wuhan virus, I was surprised to see that in the very beginning of this month, there was a survey of a tabulation of 228 countries, the impact of how many people were affected and how many people died. And it's very surprising, China was on 102. I repeat, China was on 102nd position in the list of 228 countries, because they said that, in this country of 140 billion, yeah, 140 billion population, the no no sorry, I must correct myself. In Hindi we say 140 crore, which is 1.4 billion. So they said there were only 4.12 million cases of people, and the total number of deaths they have reported in 3 years has been 5,241. And unfortunately, this data is not does not represent the truth, because uh, when you see other countries, our other friends would of course talk about it. But at that right and at this moment, we are finding that there has been a case of misreporting, underreporting, overreporting, blackout, and as a result, the whole world is suffering. And today we'll talk about the consequences of what has been happening in China, and the failure, where it can lead to, what more problem the world can face. So we'll talk about these consequences today. So may I request Mr. Donay to please start? Thank you.
So once again, thank you, Mr. Vijay, and Namaste, Dashidelek, Nimen Hao to everybody listening to us. Um, so let's go back to what happened actually in China in the fall of 2019, um, when there were strange cases happening in Wuhan. There were several doctors who tried to uh, sound the alarm, saying that what was happening was very strange. Uh, Something which was unknown was uh, spreading in Wuhan. And among these doctors, there was one whose name is Li Wenliang. Li Wenliang was a specialist of these kind of diseases, and he told other people in his hospital and also other people that attention should be paid to the spread, the very quick spreading of this virus. Uh, then he was condemned by the official authorities in Beijing, who told him to shut up because he was spreading unfounded rumors. And a few weeks later, he died from the virus. And there was a vast outcry about what happened, the fact that he was condemned by the authorities. So he was the one who first sounded the alarm. And then attention of the whole world started on what was happening in Wuhan. And the first country who asked the international community to launch an international investigation on the virus was Australia in January 2020. The Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, was very brave. And immediately in Beijing, the communist regime was furious. And they said to him, "How dare you do that? You, the Prime Minister of a very vast country in terms of geography, but a very small country in terms of population, because there are only 24 million Australian compared to 1.5 billion people in China." And soon afterwards, the Chinese government started a series of, how to say, implicating that the economy in Australia would suffer, trying to convince the Australian that their prime minister has been doing the wrong thing, that the consequences would be very grave for Australia. Then afterwards, the WHO, the World Health Organization, um, tried to send a delegation to Wuhan to try to find out what was happening there. They submitted a list of experts to go to Wuhan, to the Chinese authorities, who said actually it's not for the WHO to decide who is going to be in Wuhan, but it's up for the Chinese government. So they selected a few members on their part, and they refused for a few members of the delegation to be inserted in this delegation going to Wuhan. They went there, they stayed a few days, about 2 weeks, and what they found out is that they were not able to really do their job. They could not interview people, they could not visit the few places where the virus was spreading. The only thing which was done is that they had access to the Chinese data. So they went back to Geneva, and they were very cautious at the moment. They said, our job has not been done in Wuhan. And then later on, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, said that the fight against the virus in China was a people war. So that sounded familiar to all the people who knew what the people war means. And he was saying very soon that China was winning this people war. And he tried to convince the Chinese people and also foreign countries that China was doing the best among the whole world in fighting the disease. Then, afterwards, he was the main architect of the zero COVID policy. He was the one who decided all measures to so-called save lives. That was the motto. to save lives. So Chinese people, of course, they believed what he said. And the other goal of this zero COVID policy was also to control the Chinese people, to control the Chinese population, to use all the new technological means uh, which are used with the zero COVID policy to use more surveillance on the people. And that lasted for 3 years. And then it appeared to the Chinese people that all these zero COVID measures were intolerable, that they were suffering a lot from that. That, for instance, uh, mothers were separated from their children when it appeared that they may be contaminated. There were cases of also where in Xi'an, for example, where pregnant women were trying to go to the hospital to deliver, and they were barred to enter these hospitals because they had not the adequate QR code. So for them, some of these women, they had to deliver on the streets, and often from dead children, from dead babies. That was also terrible. And then afterwards, most recently, in October and November, especially in November, we saw about 20 cities in China. Uh, in these cities, you had thousands of Chinese demonstrating against this zero COVID policy. And for the first time since 1989, Tiananmen massacre, you had young Chinese people shouting down with Xi Jinping, down with the CCP. That was really a first since 1989. And also, I think this is quite interesting. For the first time, you had Chinese people saying, "We are all Uyghurs." Why that? Because uh, in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, the former name of Xinjiang was the Eastern Turkestan. There was a fire on a big building which started, and more than 10 people of an apartment died. Why that? Because they tried to get out of their flat, but they couldn't. And why they couldn't go out? Because the door was locked from outside with chains. And that created a big uproar. So this is why some of these Chinese people said, we are all Uyghurs. For the first time, we saw that. What we also noticed is that these young Chinese, especially them, they shouted slogans from Tiananmen Square massacre. And these young Chinese people, they are too young to have known what happened there. One should know that in China, the propaganda is giving their own versions of various events. And they are hiding what happened in other events, like, for example, the Tiananmen massacre in June 1989. So it's very amazing that these young students, because most of them came from universities, being it in Beijing or in Nanjing or in Shanghai, shouted these slogans because that showed that even they were not there, even they don't know exactly what happened in Tiananmen, the same slogans are shouted again, which are, we want freedom. So then, after that, this zero COVID policy also created huge problems for the Chinese economy. You may all know that China had the two digits GDP growth for more than 30 years. This was really unparalleled in the whole world. China was becoming soon the first economy in the world That was their expectation from the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. Because of the zero COVID, the GDP growth is going down very quickly. The official prediction for 2022 is 5.5% growth of the GDP, which already is the worst achievement in more than 30 years. But that figure will not be achieved. Uh, being it the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or other international organizations, they all think that the GDP growth will be less than 3%. So uh, I'm talking about this because when you have this slowdown of the economy in China, that creates social problems, including unemployment. Nowadays, the unemployment for the young people is around 20%. This is also uh, unseen in China since 1978. So these young people who cannot find job, they are also desperate. So I will end my presentation now by saying that because of that, I really think that the position of Mr. Xi Jinping is now fragile. To what extent, it's difficult to say, but one must know also that inside the CCP, there are people who are not very happy with the way he has been implementing his policy, a one-person policy, imposing his own policy with no consultations with other people within the elite of the CCP. I would say, however, that the CCP is now almost 100 years old and that no one can anticipate the CCP to fall in the next few months. I wouldn't say that at all. But this discontent within the elite of the CCP against Mr. Xi Jinping is growing. So that leads to major questions about the destiny of China.
Yeah, thank you, Dene, the way you have logically presented how things started and where they are going. Because one of the worst consequences, as you explained, the world can imagine is number one, China's output, the GDP going so low, and of course for China itself and for Xi Jinping and his group, as you said, the CCP itself is feeling suffocated, which may lead to something which the whole world is waiting for. So we'll come to some questions later at the end after our experts have spoken, because this is one issue which you have raised, which is going to attract questions. And now may I request Marco Respenti uh, of uh, Bitter Winter to please present your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Vijay. Hope you hear me well. And thank you for inviting me once more to this very important and always challenging series of webinar on China and especially on Tibet. Um, I will present a few data upon which we should always reflect. And I also pose some questions in my presentation which someone needs to answer sooner or later. Um, Apparently, it could seem that I will repeat some of the things that my colleague Monsieur Donnet just presented, but I will not. I will try to integrate with a parallel perspective what Mr. Donnet just said. Because while the whole story of COVID-19 is a mystery, the story of COVID-19 in China is a mystery within the mystery. I sum this Chinese mystery up, highlighting two main points. The first regards the origin and the dissemination of the virus. Avoiding easy conspiracy theories after years of disease lockdowns, and millions of deaths, the world doesn't yet know much about the new coronavirus. Chiefly, its origin remains obscure. This may be true and indeed is true of several diseases, but what annoys the most is that COVID-19 is that this obscurity on its origin has always gone hand in hand with too many opacity on the possible role played by Chinese laboratories, at least in its diffusion. Many factors indicates at least that A, the contagion began in China, B, the contagion started in China months before the world came to know of the new coronavirus, C, the deaths and dangers of the virus were largely a reality in China before, probably months before, the Chinese regime revealed them. D. The Chinese Communist regime covered all up, repressing doctors, some of which died, and citizen reporters who tried to alert the world. E. The Chinese regime was successful in compelling the World Health Organization in delaying its alarm to the world and actions. F. The Chinese regime told the world a huge number of lies regarding its management and solution of the pandemics. G. The real number of Chinese people killed by the virus is still unknown, as well as the general number of the victims killed by the communist regime. I just remind that the total number of the death penalties in China is a state secret. H, the so-called anti-COVID help offered and provided by the Chinese regime to the world was grossly based on fake news on the supposed defeat of the virus by the Chinese regime itself as early as the second half of the year 2020. And I, the Chinese vaccine against the new coronavirus is ineffective, while the Chinese authorities claim the contrary. These points are true beyond any doubt. For this reason, it is just to give the new coronavirus the name of CCP virus. The reluctance of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, to honestly collaborate with the world, its policy of systematically altering information and faking news, its strategy in alternating denials and half admissions, while the repression of dissidents, religious groups, and ethnic minorities, along with the staggering rise of President Xi Jinping to unprecedented and unmatched power, largely justify the definition of COVID-19 as such, the CCP virus. We can in fact at least say that the CCP is responsible for delays and mismanagement of the pandemics in China, leading to a guilty disaster in the whole world. This brings us to the second point in the mysterious story of the CCP virus, the regime's policy on COVID since summer and fall 2022. In the second half of September 2022, the number of infections in the world was the lowest since March 2020, when virtually the whole world was locked down. The World Health Organization, heavily influenced by Xi Jinping's China, at least in the pandemic's management, announced that the pandemic itself was virtually over. Yet, yet China was still closed in a new lockdown since early August. If what the WHO said at the time was correct, this new massive and strict Chinese lockdown had no reason. The situation continued for weeks, exacerbating Chinese citizens, impoverishing businesses, and destroying families. Finally, in late November, protests burst out in the street in an unprecedented measure since the 1989 massacre of the Tiananmen Square. Demonstrations were held in the nation's capital, Beijing, in the country's financial capital, Shanghai, in the trade and manufacturing center of Guangzhou, as well as in many other cities across the country. It was the zero COVID policy of Xi Jinping, harsh, severe, and apparently unmotivated if, again, the Chinese friendly WHO was not lying. On November the 24th of last year, as Mr. Bonnet just remembered, a fire broke out in a residential building in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, that its non-inhabitants call it Turkestan, or the region where the CCP's repressions against religions and ethnic groups amounts to the cultural genocide of Uyghurs and other Turkic people, paralleled by similar cultural genocide in other regions of the People's Republic of China, like Tibet in Mongolia. Reportedly, 10 Uyghurs died and an additional 9 were injured. They were victims of the CCP virus. In fact, the strict zero COVID policy, as my colleague just reminded us, of the government prevented residents from leaving the building or interfered with the efforts of firefighters. This ignited more popular demonstrations protesting an infamous and apparently useless lockdown. In front of the huge protests throughout the country, the regime seemed not to know what to do, seemed to not know what to do. I either keep on the lockdown, risking deadly incidents like Tiananmen, or lose its face in front of the opposition and the world. We all know what happened. All of a sudden, China ended the lockdown, just like nothing had happened for months. A few hours after saying that lockdown were indispensable, Chinese citizens began to move around the country and reportedly the infection skyrocketed again. While the whole world begs the Chinese regime to say the truth at least once and release true data on the infection, no one yet knows what the truth is. But we are all wondering. We wonder why the Chinese regime imposed strict lockdown when apparently there was no reason for it, and what happened to cause the regime to lift that lockdown so rapidly. In fact, if so strict a containment measure was necessary for months against all odds, how could the regime suspend it so quickly? We also wonder whether what is now being said on the large new infection in China is true. If it is, it means that the regime was right with its lockdown. But this implies, again, that the rest of the world was totally wrong, chiefly the Chinese friendly WHO. Or the opposite is true, and the infection is basically overestimated or even false. In this case, it is massive propaganda at work to imply that the regime's lockdown was correct, protesters were wrong, accusations from the world malicious, and the lift of the containment measures a mistake made only to calm down the protests before it was too late. I suspect it will take years to know the truth, while some aspects of this mystery will never be solved. So, so the most interesting question here is why? Why Beijing held so contradictory or apparently contradictory policy? Let me underline a few elements before reaching a first conclusion. Reportedly, the zero COVID policy of Xi, President Xi, has been a great tool for repression. Lockdowns and similar measures greatly helped the regime implement its gigantic and hyper technological system of control and surveillance of the people, giving it an apparent reason. Maybe Xi's policies also partially counteracted the infection by COVID 19, but for sure it brought repression to its zenith. The victims of the COVID age repression have been again religious groups, ethnic minorities, and all sorts of dissenters and dissidents. Let us look at Tibet. Voice of America, in an article on September the 22nd, brilliantly summed the situation saying that, quote, Tibetans are monitored more heavily and face harsher repercussions than people elsewhere because of the political sensitivity of the region. End of quote. Especially in the historical capital Lhasa, people were, quote, quarantined in empty stadiums, schools, warehouses, and unfinished buildings, end of quote. The situation in Tibet was unbearable, and protests began first on social media in September, to go then on the streets on October the 27th against the lockdown held since August the 8th. Tibetans were even arrested for daring to share online COVID related photos and videos. Media reported the case of a nomad, Rinchen Dongduk, and other six fellow Tibetans who were arrested on September the 14th for this reason. Other Tibetans were arrested as well in Lhasa, Nanchu, and other counties for similar crimes. Of all this repressive policy against Tibetans using the supposedly anti COVID measure, one key point is especially alarming. First, to ascertain infections, Tibetans were, of course, massively compelled to undertake antigen tests. Social media showed pictures and footage of Tibetans standing in huge and long lines on some rocky paths somewhere under even under icy rain. Many were women with their little children. All had to wait time in harsh conditions for doing the test. Secondly, even people tested negative were separated by others, quarantined, and monitored again and again. As reported by Voice of America, a Tibetan man and his three young children were taken to the Lhasa, Beijing Middle School quarantine center after his wife anti-COVID tests were inconclusive. Quote, authorities, reports VOA, required the entire family to quarantine with 800 people, end of quote. Two of those young kids, quote, developed fevers in the school facility where there were no doctors, medicine, or medical treatments, end of quote. My conclusion, it is quite difficult to describe this as a measure to secure the health of Tibetans. Again, VOA, quote, in a viral audio recording, a Tibetan father pleads with a government official at one of the Lhasa quarantine centers not to separate him from his year-old child, even end of quote, even though they were all tested negative for COVID. Quote, now we have tested positive, the Tibetan father lamented, and you want to take away our children, end of quote. Once more, it is rather difficult to describe this as a measure to secure the health of Tibetans. During the lockdown, tests on Tibetans were taken once a day, in certain areas, even twice a day. Is this caring for the health of Tibetans? I am now really concluding. But let me recapitulate the situation of Tibet through the words of former ambassador and former minister for foreign affairs of the Italian government, my country, Giulio Terzi di Sant'Agata, a keen observer of all things Chinese, who also graciously quotes Bitter Winter in this analysis of his, calling Xi Jinping's Communist China the, quote, most genocidal regime of the 21st century. Mr. Terzi indicts the, quote, horrendous exploitation made by Beijing of a virus that originated in China, that was denied by China, but that spread due to the proven, documented, and irrefutable responsibility of Xi Jinping's government, end of quote. So Terzi notes, quote, the genocide that the Chinese Communist regime has been waging for decades in Tibet and for several years in Xinjiang has intensified and accelerated with the pandemics. For Beijing, coronavirus was the perfect opportunity and weapon, not only for its aim of geopolitical domination in the world, but also to try to make even more deadly It's disinformation, propaganda, and eradication of every language, culture, religion, and ethnicity on Chinese land that does not match the characteristic of the Han race. End of quote. The pandemic, Terzi concludes again, I'm quoting, increased the repugnant falsehoods of the communist regime that portrays Tibet as a new paradise on earth. It is not heaven on earth, but it is the exact opposite. It is hell. Now, former Minister Terzi wrote these words as early as mid December 2020. The new lockdown of 2022 worsened a situation that in Tibet was already staggering. My fundamental question remains why? Why the useless lockdowns, or alternatively, the opposite? Why the useless rapid end of the supposedly highly effective zero COVID policy? Why so many antigenic tests if there was no real danger, or alternatively, the opposite? Why let Tibetans and others free to move within the country or even abroad if the new coronavirus is a serious threat? I have no answer, and I would like the CCP to give a full answer. As usual, though, I fear a totalitarian regime that managed the health of highly controlled and repressed people like the Tibetans. In a totalitarian country like the CCP led China, the horrendous practice of organ harvesting, whose victims are those who the CCP target as enemies, is a huge and rich industry. DNA profiling and the strict monitoring of the health conditions of the designated victims is, of course, strategic for organ harvesting. Have the Chinese lockdown measures been a tool to control the people even more capillary and even worse? Are the antigenic tests on Tibetans a tool in the hands of the organ harvesters? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Marco. You, as always, you have raised some questions. Sorry, you have raised some questions which, of course, the world would expect the Chinese leadership to answer. But I think the world by now understands they will not get the right answer, or maybe yet another propaganda. Thank you very much. And now we come to Chemi Lamo, the young Tibetan leader. Uh, as I said, a Tibetan activist and a person who has been through various organizations which are committed to the cause of Tibet. So, Chimilamo, we would love to have your perspective. And once again, thank you very much for rising up so early in the morning. You are in Canada right now. Thank you very much once again.
Pleasure to be joining you folks and my fellow colleagues, the panelists. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to the organizers, Chase and TYC, for your continued efforts in making sure that the webinars are accessible all across the world on this very important topic. I want to start off by saying and emphasizing that there is hope. There's always hope, and we must not lose hope because there's strength in oneness of our humanity. And just look at the people inside of Tibet. Look at the people inside of East Turkestan, continuously rising. And so with that, I want to begin with that. So when we look at just COVID-19 in general, my colleagues have done a wonderful job in setting the stage in terms of the order and the way it has happened and unfolded both in China and across the world. And if I may add to it, from the beginning, we saw that because of the lack of accountability on China's front, hiding the truth about COVID, that led to millions of deaths. However, we also saw that amidst the pandemic, while the world was struggling to keep up with it, China weaponized the pandemic to their benefit. China moved quickly to create exports, PPE, ventilators, medical supplies, whatnot, all of it to benefit themselves. And we saw the rollout of various tactics, and one was vaccine diplomacy. We saw how they would only engage in various types of donations that was directly linked with their foreign policy initiatives and their interests. We saw that in Nicaragua, be it Ukraine, but all of it comes with a cost. Of course, as does every type of business with China, because there's always some sort of strings attached when it comes to dealing with China. That was the first. Second, the propaganda. It's pretty obvious. Amongst the Tibetan people, wherever we are protesting, we often say, China lies, people die. Specifically, the lives of Tibetans who live under the Chinese colonial rule, very substandard services, whether it is the treatment of the society in a social perspective or a political perspective. And the propaganda continues, as my colleagues have already mentioned, until last week. The reports were constantly talking one thing, but then you'll see other reports completely reporting the opposite. So, as Vijay had mentioned, the deaths number of 5,241 since the pandemic had begun in 2019 has completely changed and shifted to nowadays recent numbers saying about 60,000 deaths linked to COVID, especially since after lifting the restrictions. And so it's pretty obvious that no information is completely clear when it comes out of China. And it doesn't help when there is an information blackout where, of course, world journalists, any type of agencies, aid agencies, international world organizations are not able to have access. Forget about Tibet, let alone even China. Number 3, the tactic is the response to the pandemic. So a lot of the international world seems to always turn a blind eye to the Tibetan voices, the Uyghur voices, when we talk about the human rights violations by the CCP. Why is that? It's because oftentimes countries are putting money prior to human rights, profit before people. And that's because of the increasing impact and effect of Chinese economy in the global world, right? And we saw that in the pandemic as well. Despite the fact that China had hidden all the truths, there was a time when the whole world's GDPs were decreasing, China sees, although a very small amount, but still saw one of the very few increases across the world in China. However, I want to emphasize that it's actually a double-edged sword. Because of the pandemic, China was not able to see a lot of their initially envisioned leadership in terms of the world stage. China was hoping that in 2020, that was going to be the year for Chinese leadership to celebrate the doubling of its economy over a single decade. However, we saw that didn't happen. And in fact, the increase in their GDP, which is about 2.2 to 6%, was actually the slowest annual rate increase that they'd seen since Mao Zedong. So that emphasis on the double-edged sword. In addition to that, let's look at the Belt and Road Initiative. There has been a huge roadblock. The pandemic has played a roadblock for the Belt and Road Initiatives, where they see a reframing of that Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, any initiative is not possible when there's no shaking hands happening with other nations. So all of these other nations that have chosen to shake hands with China not only have blood on their hands, but it's not actually as beneficial for them as they thought. Now, with 3 years of lockdown, mass testing, forced quarantines, we've seen an uproar. We see the fragility of Xi Jinping's leadership. And in our Tibetan Buddhist sayings, we say that all phenomena are impermanent, which makes me come to the point of hope. The situation inside of Tibet has always been terrible and has continuously worsened since 2008. The colonial rule of Tibet, has not only the typical story that you hear about the terrible situations inside of Tibet, but there are different ways of how its colonial rule has been impacting the Tibetan lives, from, as I said earlier, substandard social services, external political control, social destructiveness in a local level. So in the name of poverty alleviation and development, all we have as Tibetans have seen and have experienced with lived is just lies and many debts. The situation inside of Tibet is so bad that we've been hearing about recently the report that came out just a year ago about the colonial state-run boarding schools. The trauma and the ridiculous history that North Americans carry of residential schools is being repeated right now as we speak, where children as young as 4 years old are being stripped away from their parents for 5 days a week so that the Chinese government can completely brainwash and take away and uproot the Tibetan identity from the former next generations to come. We also heard about the forceful DNA collection and blood sampling of Tibetans. Over 1.2 million Tibetans have been forced to give away their blood and DNA samples so that China could build their largest DNA bank system in the world. So, in addition to all of the existing challenges as a Tibetan, during the pandemic, we also saw all of these inequities just further amplified for a Tibetan living inside of Tibet. Just recently, we've been seeing videos of crematoriums. There's lack of space. The amount of deaths are rising in the Tibetan areas, as is in various parts of China. However, in parts of Tibet, I heard this Tibetan person telling us that there's no absolute chances that they're able to get access to vaccines. And even if they did, there are phony vaccines that, the Chinese officials, they themselves are getting vaccinated with the vaccines that are internationally recognized, but then to the general public are not being accessed to. So all of these deaths are continuously happening. We've been hearing about monasteries, monks not being able to tenure to all of the needs of the society because of the tremendous amount of rises in debts. So where does this leave me? I want to go back to the point of hope. I know, Doné, you said that, since 1989, we saw the largest sort of dissent against China. I would disagree, because inside of Tibet, the dissent against China has always been there. Tibetans have been continuously rising left, right, and center. Since 2008, we saw massive uprisings. 2012, the pushback has always been there from Tibetans against the Chinese rule. Protests have risen even in the exile community in all across the world, especially with the revolution, the A4 revolution. We saw protests from Tokyo, Melbourne, New York, Taipei, and in Europe alone, we saw demonstrations all across London, Paris, Rome, Berlin, Budapest, and I could go on. And the people were shouting the same slogans, asking Xi Jinping to step down, whether it was in the streets of Beijing or Shanghai to the rest of the world. For me, I was joining fellow Chinese citizens whom I would have never imagined being alongside, not folks that are pro-democracy, but rather Chinese citizens who actually, one of them came during a protest and said to me, "Hey, I love my country. I've never seen anything wrong that the Chinese government did until recently. And now I'm starting to see that I was fed lies. Can you tell me the story of Tibet?" And this person is a regular Chinese student, an international Chinese student, who really honestly came up to me and asked that question of, "Can you share about Tibet?" So with that experience, and not just that, right? We've been seeing in protests all across. A friend of mine was at Columbia University, where there was protest being held in solidarity with the A4 revolution. And when they saw her Tibetan flag, they started shouting the slogans of Free Tibet. And these are Chinese citizens across the world that are screaming Free Tibet. So if that's not hope for a better future and a better world, I don't know what is. Despite the lockdown, despite the long-arm tactics and intimidation tactics that the Chinese government uses outside of China, these Chinese students are rising. So I think there's definitely hope, but also it's not something that we can blind ourselves with the reality of this, not only the situation inside of Tibet, Uyghur regions of East Turkestan, and also China. It's something that we must constantly be aware and on top of in terms of the reality. In terms of erasure of the Tibetan people, it's happening from every pillar of the Tibetan identity, from whether it is our religion, our walk of life, education, or uprooting the next generation. So what is our role? What is our role in terms of the international community? It is to be wary and always be ready to slash the misinformation, to not just debunk what the propaganda says, but also capture the nuance of how the regime constantly avoids any sort of accountability and responsibility, whether it is for the deaths of COVID or the constant lies that they're feeding, an infiltration of the West's understanding of left and progressive ideas. Recently, we also saw with pandemic how the Chinese government flipped the idea of anti-CCP sentiments to being anti-Asian sentiments, right? These are double-edged swords for the Chinese government, but it's also harming us in many ways. And so it's important that we recognize the ways that it harms our narratives and how we play into feeding into the ideas of the Chinese regime. And first and foremost, why are we calling East Turkestan Xinjiang? This is the narrative that Chinese government is feeding. And you'll see that actually various parts of India has also been renamed in various Chinese names. And it is important as part of the international community that we do not feed into the narrative that the Chinese government is constantly selling. We must constantly be battling against it and providing an alternative for the rest of the world, especially as experts and panelists and whatnot from the Human Rights Society. That's the least that we can do, is to not ascribe to the narrative of the Chinese government and also equip the rest of the world to be able to provide the reality, the truth, and have agency for the communities that are directly affected. So another nuance to be captured again is the A4 revolution, right? Now blaming the A4 revolution as a scapegoat for the amounts of deaths right now, the opening up of China. We all know that the opening up of China is not necessarily just because of the A4 revolution and the uprisings. The uprisings, even if I were to credit a lot of the protests for the slowing down of Xi Jinping or the release, the sort of letting go of the zero COVID policy, we'd be naive to think that it was merely the protests. It's really, economic powers and the way that the economic decline was happening. It was kind of clear that China was going to head towards that direction anyways. And when it did, now it has an excuse of letting go Chinese citizens that are positive in flights all across the world. And we saw these positive cases upon landing. Flights are having 30 to 40 positive cases of Chinese citizens coming from China, flying into various countries, including Europe and North America. And so what are we going to do as part of the international community in order to constantly be battling against not only the narrative of the Chinese government, but also in support and solidarity of the communities that are affected? I don't think we have time to wait for answers by the Chinese government. It's time that we have the answers of how we can move towards a better world. And there's always going to be hope, because when we look at the people that are directly affected inside of Tibet, inside of East Turkestan, and constantly how that they're rising despite the oppression, the just horrendous situation inside of their respective countries, and also Chinese citizens rising, the question again lies on us about what are we going to do to stand in solidarity. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you. I look forward to the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you, Shimila. One thing which I personally found very interesting is the way you explained that how the COVID episode or Wuhan virus episode has opened eyes of Chinese people, because they have been exposed to the lies which they used to believe very religiously. And then you gave example of a Chinese walking to you and asking, or shouting free Tibet slogan, or asking you to understand the Tibet story. And second point which you made is quite interesting, that the world is first time realizing that the narrative which the Communist Party of China has been selling to the world, or President Xi Jinping, the kind of narrative he has been trying to build, Wuhan virus has demolished it in a very decisive way. That is, I think, one of the takeaways of the whole 3 years of suffering of the world. So now we are on that stage where we have a few questions, and we have our friend Tsering Chompel, who represent Tibetan Youth Congress with us, uh, and I'm sure he will be joining us later in for the session of for question for thanks session. Oh, luckily we have Ayushi Ketkar. I was looking for her, so she has joined us, Professor Ayushi Ketkar. She is our uh, colleague who has been handling question and answer session. Welcome, Ayushi. Ayushi is a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She is at the Special Center for National Security Studies of JNU, and she has been associated with quite a few other universities as an expert in international relations and security matters. So, Ayushi, I leave the floor to you for question session. Yeah, and then we
Thank,
will have Sering Chompella to give a vote of thanks after this session is over. Yeah.
thank you, sir. After that wonderful, very insightful talk by all the experts, a couple of questions that have come about. First of all, am I audible? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Thank you. The first question that has come is COVID, uh, is it a facade for preventing opposition against Xi Jinping to gain momentum? Do you think this is why, this COVID is being used though they are not serious about curbing it, but still it is used as a way of, halting the entire population from uh, talking or protesting against Xi Jinping. So do you think this is a facade? The second question is it some way a mask to hide the failure of Chinese vaccines? As Chemi very rightly pointed out, profit over people. This seems to be uh, you know, the policy of China. This is their practice. So in this case, is again the recurrence of COVID time and again. Does it show the failure of the Chinese vaccine to such an extent that now the world realizes that probably this is a virus that is not only originated in China, but it has been done deliberately in a bid to earn more profit. So that neo-imperialist China and that aggressively profit-making China is at the forefront of it. So that's the second question. The third one is, again, you mentioned about this Chinese propaganda or mispropaganda, whatever you wish to say that. But how is it that people like you and me, how can we create an alternative narrative to counter this Chinese propaganda? What is the way out? Because while we know what the problem is, it's important to even find a solution for it. And that is something that the world seems to be, somewhere failing when it comes to countering China. Because as we all know, China's deep pockets and its inroads into a lot of international organizations makes this narrative building even more difficult. China kind of nips it in the bud. So how can we do it? Especially friends of Tibet and people who know that these occupied areas are in a bad state. How can we all come together to create that narrative against China? And last but not the least, all the speakers have mentioned, this is the last question, is China using COVID as a mask for murkier things like organ harvesting and resource extraction from its occupied territories? So do you think it boils down to those very, basic activities that China does so blatantly? And unfortunately, all the human rights activists seem to be at a loss of countering China. Do you think it actually, China has stooped to such low levels that we are having difficulty in dealing with them? So these are the 4 questions to the experts. Look forward to your comments.
Can I take the floor for just 2 minutes? Because
Yeah,
I
sure,
have
sure.
friends coming and we have a lunch very soon,
Yes,
so I have to take care of them. So just to agree totally with Chemi, I think that more than ever there is hope, more than ever. This because the main conclusion I come to is that finally the whole world is becoming more awakened uh, on what is happening in China, uh, where China is leading to, what are the terrible policies that Chinese leaders have been doing since 1949. So the world is awaking to what is China today, and this is why I do think that more than ever there is hope.
Yeah, that's I think one of the best takeaways, as you mentioned. And now, who Marco, you would like to?
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
very quick if I'm able. Thank you for the wonderful presentation that you all gave, and thank you for the very intelligent questions. I don't know if I have answers, but in this sense, I don't know if the COVID policy, China's COVID policy, and all the rest is a facade. I know for sure, as we repeated, and I think we documented, it's a tool. There is an old, very interesting saying by Sir Winston Churchill, which goes by never go a crisis, never waste a crisis. When a crisis comes around, use it for your purpose. So I'm not a conspiracy guy, so I don't know about I know I wrote on that, but with many questions, I don't know the origins of COVID. I don't know many things. I'm not a doctor, but I'm seeing as a journalist that for sure the whole COVID thing has been a wonderful tool in the hand of China. And as we said, it has been weaponized so well. So this is my direct answer. As to um, one of your following questions, what we should do to counteract propaganda. Again, it is not an easy question, but what we are doing daily in different from different walks of life is the right thing to do. We as a journalist, we try to report on data. You analysts try to provide us data to counteract what China says. It's like I mean it's not a fair game. China is a gigantic monster with many people working full time with a lot of money. We are not at that, but we will never surrender. We keep on doing, even if I may, small things like a webinar on a Sunday morning to wake up early as our friend did, and fight for the truth. This is what at least we owe to our intellectual honesty. And finally, if I may, about I really was interested in your saying about hope. I do believe in hope. Hope is the it has also spiritual, a very deep spiritual and even religious meaning, which I'm very fond of. So I'm totally with you with hope, but don't we need to be very careful. This is what I'm saying. I've been, and you have been studying, I think, the history of the communist past of mind, the communist history, and specifically the history of Chinese communism. They have been able to cope with many crises. The history of the Soviet Union is a 70 years long history of coping with the worst crisis. At the end, one of those crises destroyed the USSR. So there is a room for hope. But look at China. They were able to survive the USSR. They were able to survive Tiananmen, and they were able to sell to the blind West their falsities on Tiananmen and many other things. So hope is a theological virtue, as I see it. So I am totally with you, but don't give room to the CCP to keep to to blackmail us with our hope for hope with their continuous lies. They're masters in deceit.
For sure, Marco. I think
Yeah,
recognizing the tactics used by these authoritarian regimes is very important. Not only just recognizing, but actually that answers Ayeshi's question of, what are the ways that we can tackle the solution rather than just recognizing the problem, is to be able to understand the tactics that they're using. The tactics that they're using are not any different, actually, to be honest. I think it's quite funny because it's just duplicates, even though they think that they're quite strong and we see China as quite a gigantic monster. A lot of the tactics that they're using to oppress the people, to gain influence, to gain international recognition, and get away with all of their human rights violations is absolutely the same. They're using Olympics, they're using residential schools. All of these tactics have been used by the Europeans when they're colonizing North America, or when there was British rule in India. Like, many of the tactics are absolutely the same. It's quite the colonial idea of divide and conquer that they use by creating differences within the communities to be able to gain power. So definitely, I think that is actually part of the solution, is to be able to point out the flaws in the system, point out the duplicity of their tactics that they're using, and then create alternative solutions that are centered by giving agency to the communities that are affected to be providing the solutions. So in response to Aishi, weaponizing the pandemic is definitely clear, right? All of the ways that the Chinese government has used the pandemic to their benefit is absolutely clear, whether it is withholding information or to create an increase in their GDP while the rest of the world is trying to just cope. It's quite clear. Whether or not it's a complete facade, I think it's challenging to be able to say. However, what is to be noted is that they're always intentional about any step that they take. There's a saying that they take a step back, but they take 2 steps forward, right? And so it's important to recognize what are the ways that they do that. And in terms of the solution, actually, you actually said we all know the problem, and I would like to actually push back and ask: do we really know the problem? And who is this we that we're referring to? Because there's not a clear consensus in terms of the references that we use. Because for you as an Indian, for me as a Tibetan who's born and raised in India, I think in many ways we have very similar references. But also, when it comes to the West and the rest of the world standing in solidarity with Tibetans, the references are not actually clear, because time to time I always find myself in various panels where folks are pro-human rights, but at what cost, right? Where does the silver lining lie? When I'm also a Canadian Tibetan, so here, when we were asking for Canada to boycott the Olympics, I had a huge backlash of actually my principal of my university, who was a former Olympian. He was debating with me on national Canadian news channels saying, no, Olympics should happen. I know human rights are an issue, but Olympics should happen. Canada should take part. And I was there like, how is this possible that the West is now, ascribing to this narrative? And it's okay. Human rights is the ultimate sort of word to go with until it affects our trade, until it affects the person that we're interested in, right? And so there's a silver lining to be recognized. And I think it's important that we point out, do we really recognize the problem? And if we do, then what is it? What is the problem? And what is, our priority? Is our priority human rights? Is our priority people? Not always the case. Sometimes profits are over people in our respective countries. And so it's important that we acknowledge the truth, not only on China's truth, but also our truth. And then when we do that, I think we can go beyond, and then we can draw the line that's realistic and based and pragmatic. Say, yes, human rights matter to us, but if it comes at the cost of losing 40% of our trade, probably not. And if that's not the case, where you want to stand in solidarity with Tibetans and Uyghurs, okay, then where else can you stand in solidarity with Tibetans and Uyghurs? Let's talk about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Let's talk about Central Tibetan Administration, the funding that goes to the Central Tibetan Administration that allows it to thrive, right? There are different ways that the international community can show up for the Tibetan people and the people that are affected. And it's just a matter of being honest about where we stand. And then the solutions will come just when you listen to the people that are affected, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I
Thank
think now this is time to conclude. And we have with us our friend Sering Chompel, who is the Joint Secretary of Tibetan Youth Congress. As I said in the beginning, that it is Tibetan Youth Congress and the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement who are organizing this series of webinars. So, as co-host, I would request Sering Chompel to please give a vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much to all the panelists and the Vijay sir who always organize the webinars and the chairman. And we would like to thank you, the Mr. Mr. Adonat and Mr. Marco and Shimila also. And thank you very much to hosting this wonderful topic, which is against the Xi Jinping and the mention of the failure of COVID-19 in Tibet international level. So I would like to, on behalf of Tibetan Youth Congress, thank you very much to all the panelists and the Vijay sir. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. And our special thanks to our friend Losang Setenla, who has been holding the fort for the digital fort for all of us. Thank you, Lobsang Chetanji, for providing all this support. And very soon we will meet again with a new subject, which is related uh, to the Himalayan region, especially the areas in China, around China, occupied countries by China, so that the world finally understands the fineness of colonialism in its latest shape. So, next time we'll come out with one new subject. And till then, namaste, tashidelek to everybody.